Dr. Wodak is the President of the Australian Drug Law Reform Foundation and was the President of the International Harm Reduction Association between 1996 and 2004. Significantly too, he helped establish the first needle syringe program and the first medically supervised injecting centre in Australia when both were pre-legal. And you can imagine, in light of the debate in Victoria of late, what a feat that was. And he often works in developing countries on HIV control among injecting drug users. Today, Dr. Wodak will talk about a human rights approach to psychoactive drugs. So if you can join with me in welcoming Dr. Wodak.
The introduction. I feel very honoured and humbled to be asked to speak at a centre named after the great Ron Castan. What an extraordinary legacy and inspiration he left behind. I hope that my talk today about drug policy would be consistent with his contempt for prejudices and his stalwart commitment to the protection of human rights. I'm going to discuss the history of global drug prohibition, the current system around the world, the developments in the last few decades, the recent recognition of the failure of the war on drugs, principles of drug law reform, and also talk about the centrality of human rights to the drug law reform process that's taking place now. The global prohibition of drugs began slowly in the 20th century. Some were inspired to start thinking about global drug prohibition when the international movement to abolish slavery finally achieved its goals in the early 19th century. The drug prohibition movement gained further impetus because of Britain's role in forcing China to take Indian opium. And this process started with the East India Company in the 1730s, but accelerated after the British established a colony in India. At that time, as now, China had a massive trade surplus with the rest of the world, including India and the United Kingdom. Indian opium helped to reduce this trade deficit and also paid for up to a quarter of the costs of Britain's costs in running the colony in India. American Christian missionaries in China began reporting back home about the cruelties of Britain's opium policies in China, and including the two opium wars of the 19th century. This led to the United States convening the Shanghai Opium Commission, attended by 13 countries, on the 26th of February 2009. The Shanghai meeting led to the first international drug control treaty, which was negotiated at the International Opium Convention in The Hague in 1912, and the critical 1925 Geneva Opium Convention, which was held under the aegis of the League of Nations and included for the first time cannabis. The Geneva Convention proposed that drugs should be used only for medical and scientific purposes, and that there should be stringent controls on drug production at source. Now, after the end of the Second World War, drug prohibition became established as part of the United Nations system, with 3 international treaties in 1961, 71 and 88, and an array of organisations responsible for the development, implementation and monitoring of drug policy. This year is the 50th anniversary of the 1961 Single Convention, the first of the 3 UN drug treaties, and referred to by this name because it brought together all the treaties that had been negotiated under the League of Nations under one roof, as it were. And it's important that we remember that the United Nations was founded on the ashes of the Second World War with 3 critical objectives: to assist economic development, to ensure national security, and to protect human rights. The UN has also been strongly committed to global drug prohibition, but this is a lesser commitment than that given to the 3 paramount objectives I mentioned a moment ago. And here are the major aims of this system of global drug prohibition: to minimise recreational drug use, but nevertheless to ensure that supplies that are needed for medical and scientific purposes are made available. The declaration on the 17th of June 1971, just 40 years and 1 month ago, of a war against drugs by President Nixon was very effective politically, but failed comprehensively as a policy. It helped Nixon win a landslide victory at the next presidential elections in 1972, ensuring that Nixon won 49 out of the 50 states. And this was despite Nixon waging a deeply unpopular war in Vietnam at that time. Politicians around the world noted the effectiveness of this strategy and emulated this approach in their own domestic battles. In 1981, a new epidemic was recognised, later termed AIDS, and subsequently found to be due to an infection with a virus which came to be called HIV. Within a few years, the critical role in most regions of the world of HIV spreading among and from people who inject drugs was recognised, and this slowly prompted a reconsideration of the costs and benefits of conventional drug policy, which was heavily reliant on drug law enforcement. In the last 2 decades, it's become clear to many that drug consumption and problems increased with more global drug prohibition as prohibition was intensified. Many politicians have known for some time that drug prohibition did not work and could not work. For example, the Parliamentary Joint Committee into the National Crime Authority here in Australia in 1989 declared that over the past 2 decades in Australia, we've devoted increased resources to drug law enforcement, we've increased the penalties for drug trafficking, and we've accepted increasing inroads in our civil liberties as part of the battle to curb the drug trade. All the evidence shows, however, not only that our law enforcement agencies have not succeeded in preventing the supply of illicit drugs to Australian markets, but it is unrealistic to expect them to do so. Note that the cost to human rights of relying heavily on drug law enforcement was apparent to this committee in 1989. This was a multi-party committee. Despite making this unambiguous statement, the members of this committee continued to defend drug prohibition whenever necessary after they left that committee. Former US Secretary of State George Shultz said at a private meeting in 1989, after leaving office, and he didn't know that this was being recorded, he made this comment. Seems to me we're not really going to get anywhere until we take the criminality out of the drug business and the incentives for criminality out of it. We need at least to consider and examine forms of controlled legalisation of drugs. Every few days now, somewhere around the world, a police commissioner or a senior political leader admits that the war on drugs has failed. Political elites have known this for years. On the 2nd of June 2011, 19 stellar international figures of the Global Commission on Drug Policy announced this in New York. This group included a former UN Secretary General, Kofi Annan, a former US Secretary of State, George Shultz, a former Chairman of the US Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, the Prime Minister of Greece, George Papandreou, the former Presidents of Brazil, Colombia, Mexico and Switzerland, and Sir Richard Branson of Virgin Airlines, and others. The war on drugs has failed comprehensively, completely and utterly. Drug use has increased under prohibition. In the first half of the 20th century, illicit drugs were only a problem in one country, the USA. Illicit drugs became a problem in almost every country in the world in the last half-century, since the UN established a system of global drug prohibition. According to the UN estimates, between 1998 and 2008, the number of people worldwide using heroin increased by 35%, the number using cocaine increased by 20%, 7%, and the number using cannabis increased by 9%. In 1998, the UNODC, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, declared a drug-free world, we can do it. In the next decade, after declaring a drug-free world, global heroin production more than doubled, and global cocaine production increased by 20%. Prohibition supporters argue that drug use will increase after legalisation, but drug use has grown steadily under prohibition, more production, more consumption, and an ever-increasing variety of new drugs. Drug use has also become cheaper under prohibition. Although drug law enforcement is supposed to make drugs more expensive, global prices of heroin and cocaine have fallen by about 80% in the last 20 years. Nor has prohibition kept communities safe. 91% of all research studies evaluating the relationship between drug law enforcement and violence have concluded that the more intensively drug law enforcement is implemented, the more severe the violence. Since Mexico started a war on drugs in December 2006, almost 40,000 people have been killed in the resulting violence. Prohibition has seriously undermined the human rights of people who use drugs. It has reduced their freedom of association. It has reduced their right to the same health care as other members of the community. It has often resulted in cruel and unusual punishments, including capital punishment. Prohibition has undermined the rule of the law. In the United States, when drug cases are decided in ways that seem to be inconsistent with national frameworks, as they often are, this is referred to as the drug exception to the Bill of Rights, or the drug exception to the Constitution. The great Jonathan Mann taught us in the early years of the HIV epidemic that the protection of human rights was the alpha and omega of any effective response to HIV. It has taken us almost 3 decades to appreciate the wisdom of his insight. Prohibition has not kept us healthy. Heroin overdose deaths were virtually unknown in Australia before the Commonwealth prohibited heroin in 1953. There were 6 drug overdose deaths in 1964 and over 1,100 in 1999, and almost 400 every year of the last decade. Prohibition made the difficult task of reducing HIV among and from people who inject drugs even more difficult. Supporters of drug prohibition fought tooth and nail against needle syringe programs and methadone treatment, even though these have been shown to be very effective in reducing HIV infections. Prohibition has not made drugs hard to get. In an officially commissioned Australian survey in 2009, 87% of a sample of Australian drug users reported that heroin was either easy or very easy to obtain, with similar proportions for cocaine, amphetamine and cannabis. Is this a good return on the investment of billions of our tax dollars spent every year on drug law enforcement? Prohibition pushes people into the arms of criminals and organised crime. Many people who use illicit drugs commit no other crimes, yet they often end up buying drugs from violent criminals. Why push otherwise law-abiding citizens into the arms of criminals and organised crime? Prohibition has been an expensive way of making a bad problem much worse. These days, governments cannot afford to continue raining gold bars down on customs, police, courts and prisons. The results of this generous funding has been continuing high levels of death, disease, crime and corruption. Meanwhile, drug treatment and social measures, which could make a real difference, are starved of funds. If the purpose of prohibition has been to make toxic substances readily available to anyone who wants them in a flourishing market economy controlled by violent organised crime, then current policy has been a roaring success. Not only has drug prohibition failed, it can never work. Supporters of a criminal justice approach to illicit drugs are always unable to answer these 4 questions. First, if we cannot keep drugs out of our prisons, how can we keep drugs out of St Kilda Road or Fortitude Valley or King's Cross? Second, given the spectacular failure of alcohol prohibition in the United States in the 1920s, why would anyone expect prohibition of drugs to be any different? Thirdly, if a kilogram of heroin costs $1,000 in Bangkok and $300,000 in King's Cross or St Kilda, how can that kilogram of heroin be stopped from reaching Australia? Fourthly, if prohibition is such a good idea for the drugs responsible for 3% of drug-related deaths in Australia, why then not extend prohibition to the drugs responsible for 97% of drug-related deaths in Australia, namely alcohol and tobacco? We can respond effectively to drugs by aiming primarily to minimise the harm caused by drugs, while also aiming to minimise the harms and costs of our responses to drugs. This means that attempting to reduce drug consumption should not be the objective, although it can still be the means to an end of trying to reduce harm. Black markets for drugs are pernicious and cause many of the harms we call drug problems. These black markets will never be eradicated completely, but drug law reform is likely to shrink back these black markets substantially by removing the oxygen of lucrative profits. While prohibition continues, the huge black markets will continue to thrive. To get better outcomes, drugs will have to be handled primarily as a health and social problem, with funding for health and social measures increased to the sorts of levels now enjoyed by drug law enforcement. Let us think how cannabis might be managed after drug prohibition. First, cannabis must be taxed and regulated, with health warnings on the packets. I don't know what that means. I don't know what to do about it. Sorry, I don't know what to do about that. Just close it? Close the box. Thank you. With health warnings on the labels, on the packets, information on the label for people seeking help stopping or cutting down, bans on cannabis advertising and donations to political parties, and proof of age required for persons over the 18 before sales can be effected. Consumer information should be provided, including the concentration of THC. Hard to get and easy to lose licenses should be required at the cultivation, wholesale and retail stages. When cannabis is provided by criminals, as happens now, with cannabis prohibited but strong demand persisting, cannabis consumers don't pay any tax, don't get health warnings, don't get help-seeking information, don't get consumer information, don't have a clue how strong the cannabis is, and there are no restrictions on sales to young people or pregnant women. People dependent on currently illicit drugs should be treated like people dependent on alcohol and nicotine, as patients, not criminals. When simple and inexpensive treatments have been provided to someone with a severe drug problem and none have helped, treatment with a suitable substitution drug should be considered, just as methadone treatment is offered to people with heroin dependence or nicotine replacements provided to smokers trying to quit. Treatments provided should have good evidence of effectiveness, safety and cost effectiveness. A small proportion of severely dependent consumers account for a substantial proportion of the drug market. Attracting and retaining this group in treatment benefits these individuals, their families and the community. Treatment also reduces the number of new users. There may be a case for considering the commercial sale of small quantities of low concentration preparations of carefully selected drugs if the above changes do not produce enough benefits. Demand for what are currently classified as illicit drugs is likely to shrink substantially once the other elements of the package I've outlined have been implemented. Until 1906, edible opium was taxed and regulated in Australia and was sold legally in grocery shops. Coca-Cola contained cocaine in the United States until 1903. So we shouldn't be talking about legalizing drugs, but re-legalizing drugs. However, 1 kilogram blocks of 100% pure heroin or cocaine should never be sold from supermarket checkout counters. I'm confident this will never happen. It shouldn't happen. For those for whom English is a second or a third language, I've tried to make this clear in this slide. Heroin-assisted treatment is now available in 5 countries. This means high-dose heroin dispensed daily to patients who inject themselves in a clinic and also receive considerable psychosocial assistance. For that small minority with very severe problems for whom nothing else works, heroin-assisted treatment has been proven to be very effective, safe and cost-effective. Street heroin causes major problems for drug users, their families and their communities, yet legal regulated heroin in the form of heroin-assisted treatment provides huge benefits for these populations. Doesn't that tell us something? We will never make progress with illicit drugs while we keep ignoring the basic law of supply and demand. The fall of the Berlin Wall reminded us all of the high costs of ignoring basic economics. Decriminalisation is not as bad as prohibition, but still leaves us with all the problems of a black market. The only way we can minimise the pernicious black market is by enabling the immovable mountain of politics to accommodate the irresistible force of economics. When politics and economics clash, as they often do, politics usually triumphs in the short term, but economics usually triumphs in the long term. But attitudes to drug... Oh, sorry, this is the Gallup poll from the United States showing a change in opinion over the last 40 years. Every year, citizens of the United States, a sample of citizens of the United States were asked, do you think the use of marijuana should be made legal or not. And notice how supporters in the dark green at the top have been declining, and notice how the opponents of legalisation have been declining and supporters have been increasing. In 1969, there was a 72% gap. In 2006, there was a 24% gap, and in 2010, the gap was just 4%. So it's fairly clear what's happening. On the 2nd of November 2010, in the US midterm congressional elections, 46% of voters in California supported Proposition 19 to tax and regulate cannabis. Yes voters were younger, and so we all know what's going to happen next time this proposition is put to the people of California and probably other states as well. On the 2nd of June, as I've mentioned, the Global Commission on Drug Policy met in New York and said fundamentally that drug prohibition has failed and other options need to be considered. So in conclusion, psychoactive drugs are part of all cultures. Communities fear new drugs and often impose bans, and these bans are often initially quite popular. But it's clear now that drug prohibition has failed and cannot be made to work. Decriminalisation is not as bad as prohibition, but still leaves us with the black market problems I mentioned. Many countries are now changing policy, about half a dozen countries in Western Europe and another half dozen in South America. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wodak, for a very erudite and impassioned presentation. I'm sure we have many questions, and we've got about 10 minutes, if that's okay. So if you could fire away in the middle, please. The microphone could quickly be conveyed there, because we are running out of time. Just to the middle.
Mani Satija, thanks for the talk, Dr. Wodak. Another aspect of the prohibition which I think is interesting and quite relevant to Australia is a sense of ignorance about the value of certain substances which have been prohibited, whether that's therapeutic or psychiatric value. Or I understand there's a group of substances which are actually constitutionally protected in some countries in South America because they serve cultural purposes and religious purposes. Now, only earlier this year, the Australian government opened submissions. The Attorney General's Department are looking to... my understanding is they're basically looking to add a whole new list of substances to Schedule A classification. What's your view on the consultation process of that in terms of actually educating themselves about what they're prohibiting by talking to doctors and scientists and psychiatrists and therapists?
Well, there are several parts to that fascinating question. The first part is really a technical exercise of trying to determine the toxicity, the dangerousness of different substances, and that and some of the drugs that have been identified in the consultation process you mentioned, it's ludicrous that they're being considered in that. And I think it's also, while I'm all in favour of consultation, the more the better, we have to really, I think, be a bit more thoughtful about it. This consideration of which drugs are really very dangerous and which are perhaps not quite so dangerous is really very much a technical exercise, and I don't really see why this exercise was opened up to widespread consultation. The second part of your question, I'm not sure whether you were referring to this, but there's a very important matter that's going on now regarding Bolivia. And Bolivia, under the rules of the UN system, requested, well, I'll go back a little bit. In 1961, the Single Convention, borrowing a lot of the legacy from the League of Nations that I mentioned, banned three plants and drugs derived from those plants, opium, the opium poppy, the coca plant, and cannabis. And there was a very difficult question about what to do with coca leaf. And it couldn't be resolved in 1961, so they decided to leave it for 25 years and then resolve the question 25 years later. And the issue was that the production and consumption of coca leaf had existed for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, in parts of South America. At the end of 25 years, in 1986, no action was taken, and no action has been taken since then. So this is a big issue in Bolivia, which has its first indigenous leader now, Evo Morales, who's a former coca grower himself and a former leader of the coquilleros movement in Bolivia. And Bolivia, under Evo Morales, following the rules of the UN, has tried to get this question resolved and hasn't been able to. So he's indicated that Bolivia is leaving the single treaty and then will come back, accede to it again, but without agreeing to the coca leaf part. So this, and what's really behind all this is a recognition of the rights of indigenous people. In 1961, those rights were much less well recognised than they are today. And so this is something that I think, whilst it's in an area of arcane drug policy, it's really fundamentally a question about the human rights of indigenous peoples, and the Bolivian people should, and their governments should be supported strongly by all people who support the rights of indigenous people, in my view.
Lizzie at the back there.
Hi, my name's Lizzie. I'm from Morris Blackburn Lawyers. I just wanted to ask you about one of the things that occurred to me in your talk, which was fascinating, was the idea that consumers of drugs should be able to make ethical choices about where their drugs come from as well. Because when you mentioned that drug users and traffickers can face the death penalty in certain situations, that's obviously an issue that's pertinent to Australia now, as we have 2 Australians on death row in Indonesia for precisely this reason. And people are often very happy to condemn people who break the law when it relates to drugs based on a perception that causes harm, but they're not often willing to look at their own behaviour and how that might contribute to people finding themselves in this position. And I wonder if you had any thoughts that you'd like to share about the ethics of the trade itself and how regulation and legalisation can promote more ethical practices in the production and transportation of drugs.
Well, there's, again, 2 parts of that. On the first part, I think it's self-evident that when drugs are regulated, even though it won't be a perfect system, that it just seems self-evident that we're better off with the Minister for Consumer Affairs trying to regulate drugs than leaving it to Al Capone or some of his contemporaries here in Australia. So that much is obvious. There will always be a black market. We won't get rid of black markets. There is 10% of the tobacco market in Australia is said to be provided by a black market. So presumably if that's true for the tobacco market, it'll be something like that will be also true for the other markets. I think your comment about 2 Australians on death row, I wish it were only 2. I think it's actually many more than that. But I think Australia's involvement in those 2 in Bali was reprehensible. No Australian citizen should ever be required to think about going through a process that can lead to capital punishment when that punishment has been off grounds in Australia for more than 30 years and is also banned under an Act of Parliament that had bipartisan support. But Australia should really get behind the international movement to try and ban capital punishment worldwide. And capital punishment or drugs are a major reason why capital punishment is carried out in many countries in the world. Fortunately, the number of countries that are carrying out capital punishment is diminishing, as you know, and the number of capital executions is also declining.
Okay, we have a question just here.
More of a statement, really. Helps if you have it up the right way. I'm just wondering, now that we're getting politicians coming in at a younger age, whether your premise will be agreed to by those younger politicians when they finally have the courage to admit that they actually do inhale?
Well, yes, I'm very optimistic. I think that attitudes are changing, as you saw on that US Gallup poll. They're not changing like that in Australia yet, but once the first large US state votes in favour of taxing and regulating cannabis, I think we'll see something not quite as dramatic as the fall of the Berlin Wall, but a similar kind of unravelling process will begin, which will be unstoppable, because no US president, Democratic or Republican, is going to stand up to a big state, a big popular state like California. That would be political suicide. And so I think that process is inevitable. Also, attitudes in young people about questions like gay marriage, legalisation of sex work, and the legalisation of drugs have a lot of similarities, and attitudes of younger people are very different from attitudes of older generations. And I think that will change it.
I think we'll have time for a couple more very quick questions, because again time is running short. So there was one at the back here, two at the back. Are you able to amalgamate them? Have you consulted at all?
How about I go first and try and make it as quick as possible? Catherine Leslie from the Mental Health
Could you speak up, please?
Catherine Leslie from the Mental Health Legal Centre. You mentioned that the response, rather than a law enforcement response, should be more of a health or social response. And you also commented that for some, or a group of people, that more active engagement in treatment is warranted. You might be aware that recently in Victoria there's what's called, I think it's the Severe Substance Dependence and Treatment Act, which is essentially a regime for involuntary detention and treatment of people in certain circumstances. And that obviously engages perhaps a fresh set of human rights. I'm wondering if you could share your views on involuntary detention and treatment.
Yes, a very important question. There's similar consideration in New South Wales, as it so happens, and looking further north than Australia, this is a huge topic in many countries in Asia, where involuntary detention is because people are using drugs, is carried out on an industrial scale. And is being spread very widely with the support of major UN agencies. I think there is a case for limited involuntary detention with full protection for human rights, and this happens now anyway, in people, for example, who have severe intellectual impairment or have severe mental illness, either one or both, possibly related to their drug use. In those cases where people are detained against their will, and medically I don't have a problem with that, and from a human rights perspective I don't have a problem with it either. If it's extended beyond those small groups, I do have a problem with it. But either way, whenever it's done, there has to be extensive independent review of all of the clinicians by third parties who are not linked to the provision of those health services and are fully informed about legal and human rights.
Okay, so we have the other questioner at the back, and then a lady just here in the middle.
Hi, my name's Chelsea Candy. I'm also from the Mental Health Legal Centre. This is a slightly more philosophical question. I'm thinking about the ultimate policy objective of prohibition is clearly deterrence. It's you probably don't want lots of people addicted to or using harmful substances, and I'm sure you agree with that. So I guess prohibition, I'm playing devil's advocate here, prohibition is seen as the best of a very bad set of options with the intention of deterring overall use. And there is evidence that it works, however expensive it is to money and human life. I wonder if this the sort of policy approach that you take could possibly get any further if you can't answer the question of what would replace the deterrent effect of the current regime. Is there an answer to that in the set of options that you've presented? Is there a deterrent built in to that sort of set of policies?
Well, I take issue with a number of things you said. It's a very important question. One of the main figures involved in Nixon's decision to wage a war against drugs was John Ehrlichman of Watergate notoriety. And John Ehrlichman was a member of the Committee to Re-elect the President, which had the wonderful acronym CREEP. When he came out from prison for his Watergate crimes, John Ehrlichman was interviewed on Capitol Hill about this very question, and he said that he was quite frank about the fact that he had recommended the introduction of a war against drugs, declaration of a war against drugs by President Nixon as a way of winning the 1972 re-election, and he pointed out that Nixon had been largely elected in 1968 by elderly white wealthy people who disliked, to put it mildly, young, poor and black people, and that by declaring a war against drugs, Nixon would be able to send a dog whistle to the American people that Nixon did not like young, poor and black people. Ehrlichman said all of this and said that, and this is all in a book called Smoke and Mirrors by Dan Boehm, B-A-U-M, Plenum Books. So I'm not sure that it was, I wouldn't be as charitable that it was meant to deter drug use. I think it was introduced for political reasons, and Ehrlichman actually said that straight out. The committee asked him whether the policy worked, and he said, it's not a policy, it's a political strategy. It works as a political strategy. Of course it doesn't work as a policy. The people who came after me in the White House should have known that, but they didn't know that it was actually only a political strategy. So, does it actually work as a deterrent? Well, it doesn't work as a deterrent, clearly, for many, many reasons that I could go into. But the point I should have made clearer was there will always be a role, and always should be a role, for drug law enforcement. It's a question of whether the primary emphasis should be on the criminal justice system, which it's been by now, both rhetorically and financially, or whether the primary emphasis should be on health and social measures, which have been shown to be more effective. In the 2002-2003 financial year, Commonwealth, state and territory governments spent $3.2 billion in response to illicit drugs. 75% of that, according to a study by Timothy Moore from Melbourne in Drug Policy Modelling Program, 75% of that was allocated to drug law enforcement. So there's a huge weighting, and we see that kind of preponderance all over the world.
Okay, final question just over here.
Hi, Carol Nikakis from Backrow. Dr. Wodak, I have a question for you around the prison population, and given the high rate of bloodborne viruses amongst the population and their vulnerability during incarceration, I wonder whether you see, as a matter of human rights, whether needle exchange programs will become available in the next few years.
Well, we should have needle syringe programs in prisons. 10 countries around the world have them, and the arguments for having needle syringe programs in prisons are at least as strong as, if not as strong as, having them in the community. It's a denial of human rights of prison inmates to not have the same preventative and treatment health services in prisons as are in community. People are sent to prison as punishment, not for punishment, and the punishment should not be that they should pick up bloodborne viruses while they're in prison. Let's also remember that this isn't just about the health of prisoners, because the prison population turns over very rapidly. There are about 30,000 prisoners at any one time in Australia, and about 60,000 people entering and leaving the prison system every year, and there are something like 400,000 ex-prisoners in Australia in the community right now. So any infection they acquire in prison is very significant to their sexual partners and their families and the broader community. So we should be doing this on rational grounds, on public health grounds, on human rights grounds, and also in terms of trying to save the public purse.
I'd like you to join with me once again in thanking Dr. Wodak. Thank you, dear.